And as somebody who runs a Russian studies program, I'm always amazed at how Washingtonians are afraid of even the mention of snow. So it could be that some people have been scared off. More likely, people are still getting coffee and will drift in. But I think we will get started. You'll hear me mention this often, but we have a hard time constraint. We have to leave the room promptly at 11:30 because there's another big event at noon. So I want to try to keep everyone on time. It's a pleasure for me to welcome people here on behalf of the Comparative Urban Studies program here at the Wilson Center. My name is Blair Rubel, and I manage the, we call it CUSP, together with Allison Garland, and I'd like to thank Allison and our colleagues at America's Wetland Foundation, as well as the Wilson Center's Environmental Security and Change program, for organizing this event and making it possible. At first glance, the subject of sustainable coasts may seem far removed from the issues of a program that supports research comparing urban realities around the world. But I think this particular coastline in Louisiana has provided empirical evidence that cities really can't be sustainable unless their ecosystems are sustainable. Now, I don't want to take much away from what's going to follow, but I want to make a couple of observations, having had the opportunity to look at the report, and it's available on DVD outside. I urge you all to have a look at it and to spend some time with it. It's really a remarkable document, and it's remarkable for a couple of reasons. First, I think it represents a model of democratic consensus building as well as a blending of expert and political perspectives. I don't say this as a back-of-the-hand slap at either the process or of the science. It's just the opposite. We aren't going to get traction on issues as complex as these without the full participation of the scientific community, of political institutions, and of the American citizenry. Second, unlike most reports of its kind, the authors are quite explicit that this should be a living document rather than the final word. They seek to present a conceptual vision and a general orientation of how to move towards that vision, while adding quite clearly that there is much that is still unknown. So the goal is to inaugurate a process. This report is conceived of not as an object, as a noun, but as a process, as a verb. And I think that makes this report a model for any number of reports in the future of this kind, where you're dealing with complicated policy issues that have no ready solution. And third, if we as a country are to heed this report's warning and become serious about its recommendations, we, and I mean all Americans, as a country will have to live our lives differently. I want to repeat that. We as a country, not just one city or one state or one discrete grouping of communities or one region, but we as a country will have to live our lives differently. This is a wake-up call for every American, no matter how far removed from Louisiana or from the Mississippi Delta. Finally, the report demonstrates the stakes are enormous. Not too long ago, I found myself sitting at a dinner party in Bethesda surrounded by suitably liberal interlocutors, and the subject of New Orleans came up. And they said, well, you know, we don't really have to worry about it. After all, it's just an old, outmoded culture and city. History's passed it by. The future is in nanotechnology. It's not in what Louisiana is about. City never should have been built there anyway, and it never really has given the U.S. much other than questionable music. We rarely meet people in D.C. who so explicitly write off a segment of our country, especially among self-professed liberals who sit around fancy dinner parties in places like Bethesda. But I think all of us understand that the attitude that was being expressed exists out there. If for no other reason than Katrina, New Orleans, and the Gulf Coast are, well, they're last year's story. we can move on to bigger and better things. I think anyone who spends time with this report understands that the question of the Louisiana coastline is not last year's story. We're talking about a region that produces or transports 1/3 of the nation's energy, oil and gas supply, is tied to 50% of our nation's refining capacity, handles 20% of all U.S. waterborne commerce, and provides 1/4 of commercial fishing landings of the lower 48 states. That should be enough right there. But what the report demonstrates is even if you're not in Louisiana, even if you don't care about Louisiana, if you live in any one of 31 states or 2 provinces in Canada, you're affected directly by what happens. So I think we're very proud to be putting on this meeting. We hope it will attract some attention to this important report, and we will do our best to work with the America's Wetlands Foundation to call as much attention as we can to the issues raised in this report. Each speaker has been instructed that they have 15 minutes. I will be a little bit of a pest about that because we do have to clear the room at 11:30, as I mentioned. The first speaker is King Milling. He's chairman of America's Wetland Foundation and vice chairman of the Whitney National Bank. He's a resident of New Orleans and a respected leader in the Louisiana business community. He was a partner in the firm of Milling, Benson, Woodward, Hillier, Pearson, and Miller prior to coming to the Whitney Bank. He had an undergraduate career at Washington Lee University, and he earned his law degree from Tulane. He's been a staunch advocate for restoration of Gulf Coast wetlands. I'm sure you'll realize that in about 1 minute. Long before the Hurricane Katrina propelled the issue into national headlines, Mr. Milling was championing the protection of marshes and estuaries along the Louisiana coast. As chairman of Governor Blanco's Advisory Commission on Coastal Protection and Restoration and chairman of the board of America's Wetlands Foundation, he's led the charge to save and restore Louisiana coastal wetlands.
Thank you very much. I'll try very hard to keep to my 15 minutes. To those of us who may be a little bit geographically challenged, geologically challenged, let me do a few things here. This is a picture of the southeast quadrant of South Louisiana, and this is the Mississippi Delta. New Orleans is here. The Mississippi River flows down here. The Gulf of Mexico is here. Mississippi's over here. Texas is somewhere over there. You'll notice these 2 bays, Barataria Bay and Terrebonne Bay, they play an important part in this whole arrangement. This is the famous Mr. Gold that you've probably been reading about. And I think that kind of gives us an outfit of where we should be. I first want to thank very much this institute for allowing us to be here this morning and to discuss what I think we all call in South Louisiana the elephant in the closet. There is a threat to Louisiana and to the nation and to the region, which quite frankly is unknown to many. And it all begins with the lower Mississippi Delta, a landscape created over some 6,000 years from the distribution of fresh water and sediment and nutrients as the Mississippi River over time overflowed its banks and created this great mass area that we call the Mississippi Delta. This fresh water and sediment was derived from a basin covering 41% of the United States, stretching from Utah to the west to the western regions of New York State to the east. From our standpoint, it created 2 important things. It created, first, as it was overflowing its banks, fingers of land on either side of the paths of the Mississippi River as it meandered back and forth. And you can see it clearly on this map up here and in there. That's where we live in South Louisiana. That is where our predecessors have lived, and that's where we shall live in the future. This river also created, from that same freshwater nutrients and sediments, the largest and most complex ecosystem in this country, an area of swamp and marsh and forests covering some 4 million acres, 7,000 square miles. It constituted 43% of the coastal saltwater marsh and 25% of the coastal freshwater marsh in the lower 48 states. It is the 7th largest delta on Earth. Is there any wonder that we call it America's wetland? To those of us who have lived in South Louisiana and to the infrastructure that is down there, the existence of this ever-growing ecosystem was a protection. It protected the existence of our predecessors. It protects today our homes and businesses and churches and billions of dollars of infrastructure from the ravages of the Gulf of Mexico. As the very existence of this delta diminished the intensity of storms, reduced their violence, absorbed storm surges, in fact, this complex landscape provided a wall of protection. What you must remember as we focus on this is that this deltic system has continually subsided under its own weight, only to be refurbished, rebuilt, and enhanced by virtue of this river throwing out freshwater sediment and nutrients on an annual basis or even more. Now I would like you for a moment to reflect upon the red and orange on the map behind me. That reflects the loss over the last 80 years and the projected loss in the next 50 years. The loss is staggering in scope, but what you're looking at is the little implosion of the 7th largest delta on Earth. In the last 75 years, we have lost some 2,000 square miles of this ecosystem, an area equal in size to the state of Delaware. In the next 50 years, we shall lose another potential 500 square miles, an area equal in size to the combined cities of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. In the 1990s alone, we lost between 25 and 35 square miles per year. 1 football field-sized parcel of land every 38 minutes. In the 1990s, 90 to 95% of all coastal erosion in the continental United States occurred in that area south of New Orleans, which we refer to as Barataria Bay and Terrebonne Bay. Why? What is the cause? I don't think anybody today disagrees that the root cause of this problem, the proximate cause, began in 1927 when this country, for all the right reasons, built in good faith levees up and down the Mississippi River as a result of the 1927 flood. Those levees were built to protect flooding and to maintain navigation, and they have done a marvelous job. But there was an unintended consequence. As a result of the creation of this line of levees, this ecosystem, so dependent upon that natural ingredient of fresh water, was deprived of it. And today, that system is on the verge of collapse. It is, in many instances, literally starving to death. And it is estimated that between 120 and 160 million tons of sediment every year is literally washed into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. This ever-increasing deterioration was exacerbated, quite frankly, during the 1930s by the building of a number of navigation canals linking deep water ports to the Gulf of Mexico and allowing for the intrusion of salt water. Also, beginning in the 1930s through about 1960s, oil and gas operation went from the highland into this marsh. And as a result of it, damage was done to specific areas of the marshland. At that time, of course, it must be remembered, we were going in and out of 3 separate wars, not to mention 1 depression. So at the end of the day, human elements impacted an already weakened system. We don't blame the Corps of Engineers. We don't blame the oil and gas companies. What they were doing at the time probably were considered best practices if such a concept existed. Fundamentally, however, human intervention has been the prime contributor of the loss of this massive deltic system. The law of unintended consequences prevailed. Can it be fixed? Since approximately 2001, as you shall hear later, scientists and engineers have grappled with this concept. And we believe today that with the creation of a comprehensive, a holistic plan, we can in fact reverse these actions and obtain a sustainable system. It will require us to mimic the historic patterns of the Mississippi River, to create large-scale diversions, placing that 150 million tons of sediment back into this system. It will require us to reinforce our barrier islands. It will require us to beneficially use dredge material. At the end of the day, we must push the salt water out and put the fresh water and sediment back in. It will not be the same as it was in 1920. We cannot save it all. And there is some science and engineering still to be understood, but we cannot understand it until we can begin. So we result back to the question of why. Why should this nation do it? First and foremost, to those who have a real passion, this is an environmental treasure unlike any in this country. It is one of the world's most diverse and productive ecosystems. There are considered to be over 70 threatened and endangered species living there. Over 5 million waterfowls winter there. It is twice the size of the Everglades. It is thought that 90 to 95% of the commercial fish in the Gulf of Mexico are dependent upon the existence of this ecosystem during all or part of their life cycle. Is there any wonder again that we call it America's wetlands? As relate to those of us who live in South Louisiana, this is a working ecosystem. It is the foundation of our culture, the center of our livelihood, and as America's wetlands collapses, so shall over 2 million people's lives, historic and strategic cities, homes and churches. They're all at risk. Billions of dollars of state and federal and local infrastructure is at risk as well. And to the country as a whole, this ecosystem provided security for those things which are historically critical to the economy of this country. Small example, as you've already heard, 30% of the commercial fish consumed in this country come right out of that area in red and orange behind me. And without it, that bounty will no longer be here. 30% or over 30% of all of the oil and gas that is delivered to this country and produced come right across that fragile system. The delivery of that product to the petrochemical and chemical companies and refineries is absolutely dependent upon the existence of thousands of miles of pipelines, holding tanks, compressor stations, and platforms. And without this ecosystem, all of that becomes at risk. All of it was built predicated upon the inherent strength provided by this ecosystem. It was all built predicated upon the existence of that. And without it, none of it is capable of withstanding a direct assault of the Gulf of Mexico. It also protects navigation, east and west along the intercoastal waterway system, and north and south along the Mississippi River. If this ecosystem is allowed to continue to erode, over 150 miles of the intercoastal waterway system will be directly open to the Gulf of Mexico. The economies inherent in the delivery of bulk products east and west along that system, which benefits from Texas all the way to the Florida and up the East Coast, would be at risk. No longer could we have very inexpensive delivery of product. We have not begun to consider the economic implications of that. And as to the Mississippi River, it is clear that 20% of the national cargo goes right by New Orleans every day. And if you look at that map behind me and look at the southern reaches of the Mississippi River, it becomes clear that if this ecosystem is allowed to deteriorate, the levee system keeping the Mississippi River in will have the function of keeping the Gulf of Mexico away from the Mississippi River. That levee system was not designed for those types of stresses. And the delivery up and down that corridor, so essential to the heartland of America, will in fact be at risk. Prior to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, when we related these consequences, we were looked at as if we were crazy. But what we stated was considered to be pure hypothesis. The fact of the matter is, Katrina and Rita took hypothesis and turned it into fact overnight. The damages were, in fact, well into the billions of dollars. Oil and gas spiked. Navigation impacts became real. But what you must know is that Katrina did us a favor. If Katrina had come in some 20 miles or 30 miles to the west, the fact of the matter is the cost to this country would have doubled or tripled. We were saved by Katrina, but we know the impacts in the future. The state of Louisiana today is working closely with the federal agencies seeking federal funding through Coastal Restoration and Protection and the Protection Agency, and you will be hearing lately about that. We are looking for dollars from the Water Resource Development Act, which, thank the Lord, has been passed, the OCS revenue, and for all other alternative sources. This threat is real. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. As a result of it, Louisiana is moving ahead with or without the federal government, but with the full understanding that without our federal partnerships, our options become significantly limited and the impacts upon this country become ever so much higher. We face in Louisiana the unintended consequences derived primarily from federal policy every day. We know the impacts of that upon ourselves. We are now experiencing it upon our region. And at the end of the day, if we do not get about the business of trying to figure out how to fix this problem, every citizen in this country shall feel the pain. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll hear from Sidney Coffey, who currently serves as Executive Assistant to Governor Kathleen Blanco for Coastal Activities and is Director of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. She serves the Governor on all manners of coastal issues, such as restoration projects and public education efforts. Before taking her post as Executive Assistant to the Governor, she held positions as Public Affairs Director for the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities and Communication Director for the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. She joined Governor Buddy Reimer's staff in 1988 as press secretary, and before that, she had a distinguished career in broadcasting. So I welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. If it's okay, I'm going to stay right here. I'm a little height challenged, and I will disappear behind that little screen up there. So, emphasize this is just so much more comfortable. King and Blair, I want to say that your comments at the beginning got it. Those were exciting. That was exciting to hear that, and I hope that that a lot of others get it like you do. And King pretty much set the stage of why this is happening, what is happening, why it's important to the rest of the country. And I want to start and kind of pick up from there with what the state of Louisiana has done, especially in the last 2 years, to rise up to the challenge before us. As King mentioned, for years and years, we've been making the clarion call to Washington and Congress specifically that what could happen was very, very dire. And of course, with Katrina and Rita, the sense of urgency we felt for a very long time had a big exclamation put on it, and it, in a very bittersweet way, confirmed what the scientists had been saying all along, and it focused the nation on why this is such an important area of the country. I served both Governors Foster and Blanco on this issue. And one thing that Foster used to say all the time was, we need to have a national commitment. They either pay now or they're going to pay dearly later. And as we all know, that dearly later date arrived, those two fateful days in August and September. According to the USGS, we lost about 218 square miles in those 2 days alone. So while most people deal with land loss in acreage, we've always dealt with it in square miles. And it's really hard to get your head around that. It's hard for me to get my head around that, and I've been dealing with it for over 10 years now. It's mind-boggling, the scale of what is before us. But back to what the state has done. In the past, almost 20 years ago, something called the State Wetlands Authority was created, which just dealt with coastal restoration. Just that, not the hurricane protection side of things. It's when our whole coastal program began, when the Department of Natural Resources started a coastal restoration and management program, and the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities was created so that it could be the policy arm of what was happening on the coast and keep consistencies going among policy issues. The BRO Act, or QIPRA, as most of you probably know it, was created. We call it the BRO Act because of our own John Bro, who helped author that. It brings together 5 federal agencies and the state in a partnership, and it's been working very well for about 18 years. Through the years, it started out bringing in about $20 million a year. It's ramped up to about $50 or $60 million a year, a drop in the bucket for what we're dealing with, a drop in the bucket. It has served to build some remarkable partnerships between the federal government and the state, and really helped us learn what's going on out there. It's really helped us understand what will work and what won't, although we certainly don't have all the answers. But by its very nature, we knew it was a Band-Aid approach. It had to be, because the scale and magnitude of what we're dealing with can't be dealt with $20 million or $60 million a year. These were small-scale projects. But we were on a learning curve, and I think we'll always be on a learning curve on this. After the storms, the state knew, okay, we've got to ramp ourselves up. We've got to meet this challenge, and it's not going to be easy. So we took that State Wetlands Authority, and the legislature expanded that, expanded the purview, and expanded the membership, and created the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. In my position, I chair that authority. It has been given some real power. One of our mandates is to oversee all the levee districts in South Louisiana. No fun task, I can tell you. Our main mandate was to create a comprehensive coastal master plan that started addressing this situation from a systems approach, not the piecemeal approach, not project-oriented, program-oriented, looking at the coast in a comprehensive way, understanding what had to be sequenced, what had to be prioritized. It also, for the very first time, and this is the most critical mandate I think we received, was to never again separate restoration from hurricane protection. You cannot do one without the other. It is absolute folly for some to say that it's got to all be done through environmental restoration. Can't be done. It's absolute folly for those who advocate for levees only. Can't be done. It has got to work together, and there's no other way to do it. It's not easy to integrate anything, as we all know. It's especially not easy to integrate government. When you've got the Department of Transportation, whose mission is to oversee levee construction, etc., that whole side of it. And then you've got a Department of Natural Resources whose mission is to restore the coast. And a lot of other agencies involved as well, Wildlife and Fisheries, DEQ. It goes on and on. So the challenges of integration have been very, very interesting and ongoing, and I'll get into that in just a minute. And I'm going to try to run through this real quickly, and if you have questions more about the details of how of the plan and how we're doing it, I can try to answer those questions. At the same time, the state legislature mandated us to create a master plan, a comprehensive plan. The Congress mandated the Corps to do basically the same thing. We've been working very closely with the Corps, both on our plan and on their plan. Although when their first blush of their plan is presented this month, we'll have a lot to talk about at that point, and we've got some concerns and some worries about that. I will be very honest with you about that. King said we don't blame the Corps. Of course not. I mean, we can't. They are mandated to do what they do by Congress. But I will tell you that there's probably no other state in the nation that has the intimate relationship with the Corps of Engineers at the very highest level as Louisiana, and it's it's a love-hate relationship. But we understand each other, and believe it or not, we do work very well together. Some of the other things that the state did: reorganization of levee districts. For too many years, those levee districts had become distracted about what their true purpose was, which is really the protection of people from flooding. We eliminated the political patronage, gave them new focus, professional accountability, and constant oversight and guidance by the CPRA. The voters of our state did something that is just, I can't explain how wonderful this was. They passed a constitutional amendment by 82% of the vote before Congress ever passed the sharing of outer continental shelf oil and gas revenues with the coastal producing states. Before that happened, the state of Louisiana passed a constitutional amendment that would dedicate every penny of future OCS revenues to this and this alone, the protection and restoration of our coast. I think that was very farsighted by the citizens of our state. It was about 90 days later that the federal OCS revenue sharing bill passed, and we are very, very happy about that. The reason we're happy about that is for too long we've been dependent on the dribble and drab of appropriations, and I mean that's just a fact. Look at the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Has it ever been funded in any real way? No. We're in a constant fight for dollars, and we cannot be subject to appropriations only, although appropriations are going to be very, very, very important to us in the years to come. But the revenue sharing gives us a dedicated stream of revenue that helps us do this enormous task and helps us be able to plan and follow it through. Without that, we can't even attempt it, and we knew we weren't going to be able to for a long time. That revenue sharing doesn't start in earnest till about the year 2017 because of that pesky little 10-year budget window that all of us in this room, I'm sure, are very familiar with. So we've done some things that I think will help bridge the gap. The legislature put up $200 million up front to help us jumpstart this thing. In the Energy Bill of 2005, the Coastal Impact Assistance Program was passed, and that was the first version of a sort of revenue sharing that was based on revenue sharing that gave the coastal producing states an amount of about $1 billion over the next 4 years that will go to these this protection and mainly restoration efforts. And Louisiana gets about $520 million of that amount. We were the first state that put our plan in. As you can imagine, we had our plan, our CAP plan, before the MMS was ready to accept the plan. They approved the plan last week, and the money will start flowing. We've jump-started that. We've fronted that money already on the state side. Now, we're going to be okay probably for around the first 3 or 4 years. Then there's going to be an enormous gap before that OCS revenue sharing starts. And we've already passed a coastal financial corporation that will put together what we need in order to bond the money against those future federal revenues. That's not easy either because you're talking about future projected federal revenues. But anyway, that's another fun thing that we'll be dealing with, and at least we've got the corporation set and ready to do that. Now the plan, as I mentioned, this is the overarching vision. This is the overarching vision for the state of Louisiana. Everything we do every federal program we cooperate with, everything that we cost share, everything that we do in the way of coastal protection restoration will be based on this plan. And it will determine whether or not we're going to cost share on other programs. It's got to be consistent with this plan. It's got to be a priority of this plan. And it's got to be within the sequencing of what the scientists and engineers are telling us has to go first. It has to be a comprehensive approach. It's conceptual. It represents the careful balance that we must achieve because of the balance of things that happen on this coast. It employs the best science and engineering and will continue to. That's going to be a very critical piece of all of this. We are developing right now the structure of how we implement this plan, and science has to be integrated at every step of the way. This is what I call science in real time, and I know these guys are going to talk a lot more about it, but this is where the rubber meets the road. This is mission-oriented science. We're going to be asking for it's like flying the plane while you're building the plane. We don't have all the answers. We don't have time to get all the answers before we get started. That's going to happen as we go. So as we go forward and we're building this plan, we need to check back with the system and see how that's going to respond. And if it's not responding in the way we're anticipating, we've got to be able to come back and adapt this plan and adapt what we do. We're going to need science to be right there. So when we say we've got to have this answered, we've got to have those answers as quickly as we possibly can. It is truly science in real time. And it's going to be a remarkable thing to watch, I think. It's going to be a model before it's over, I hope, for the way we go here in the future. The objectives of the plan: reduce risk to economic assets, restore sustainability to the coastal ecosystem, maintain a wide and diverse array of habitats for fish and wildlife, and sustain Louisiana's unique heritage and culture. Some of the challenges that we're dealing with in the plan: climate change and related sea level rise, changes in rainfall patterns, integrating protection systems into a sustainable landscape, combined effects of multiple river diversions, large and small, functionality of marsh restoration using dredged material, sediment availability, that's a real issue, for both wetland restoration and hurricane protection systems. We're already running into that, and how hard it is to find suitable sediment, even to build these levees and to raise them. Nutrient concentrations in the Mississippi River. Remaining questions will be addressed. There are some things, however, we know are going to be essential to our success. Restoring sustainability to the coastal landscape by maximizing the use of the Mississippi River and the use of the Atchafalaya River. Harnessing those natural processes is what we have to do if this is ever going to be sustainable. We can pipe sediment all day long into areas, and that will be done. That will be done, but more as a supplemental effort, not a main effort. But if we don't capture those natural resources, if we don't figure out what to do with the bottom of that Mississippi River and get that sediment and that fresh water back into this system, which, by the way, if you think we've got some tough choices, wait till we sit down with navigation on that issue. I mean, it'll blow your mind when you think about the different interests on our coast and what a microcosm it is for sustainability throughout the world. I know I'm getting ready to go over time, aren't I? Okay, I'm hurrying. Restoring critical landforms, hydrologic control of navigation channels, ridge habitat restoration, et cetera, et cetera. And it's more than just, levees don't necessarily mean that they're not the only thing that means protection, okay? When we talk about protection, the plan also talks about proper evacuation planning, elevated homes and businesses. We've got to change the way we use our land, okay? Insurance, huge issue. All of these things are taken into account within the plan. I'm going to skip over that. I've talked about the money. There are a lot of things that the state, and if you want to get into it, I'll certainly answer the questions, that the state is taking action on now. We're in the middle of a transition. We are literally transferring government from Governor Blanco to Governor Jindal. And so this is that magic time when a lot of things are up in the air, but we cannot lose momentum in this transition, especially now, and that's going to be very challenging. And as we build toward the true and earnest implementation of this plan, all the things that we do are going to be carefully watched, and I can't tell you how challenging that will ultimately be. In closing, I want to say there are just some big issues that I think we need to deal with on a national level. For one thing, Louisiana can serve as the laboratory for sustainability worldwide. Let's take this opportunity as a nation to see what will work and what won't work. Let's take this opportunity as a nation to understand that what happens on this coast is vital to the nation's economy, to its energy security, and to the health of its environment. Let's, as a nation, get together, Everglades, Chesapeake, Cal-Fed, Puget Sound, Great Lakes, certainly Louisiana. As a nation, let's come together and let's all agree that WRDA is broken when it comes to major ecosystem restorations, that we've got to change that process. But it's going to take the political will and the understanding by these very powerful areas that are dealing with this in a very real way in order to work with Congress to change and be very creative about how we address this ecosystem restoration issue. And let's all understand that on the issue of sea level rise, that what's happening right now in Louisiana is simply the harbinger for what's going to happen to the rest of our coastal areas. So watch us very closely, join with us. This is new territory that we're plowing right now, and it's not easy, and we need all of your help and everyone that you represent to be right there with us. Thank you.
Dr. Robert Twilley is Director of Wetland Biogeochemistry at the Wetland Biogeochemistry Institute and Professor of the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Science at Louisiana State University. He had his graduate training, he received his PhD from the University of Florida. His research is focused on systems ecology and biogeochemistry of coastal wetlands, both in the Gulf of Mexico and throughout Latin America. He and his research have been instrumental to the restoration of nutrient dynamics of coastal ecosystems of the Florida coastal Everglades, and much of that work has been supported by a program through NSF. You do have a PowerPoint, am I correct?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so if people are having difficulty seeing the PowerPoint, just
Do you want us to
wave
move?
and we'll kind of move
Yeah.
a little bit to the side so I'm sure you can see.
It goes without saying that least articulate uses PowerPoint, right? Now I have to find it. Here it is. Blair, thanks for the introduction, and I want to really thank the opportunity to give you a 15-minute lecture on restoring a Delta 101. And that my job here is to attach some images to the problems and discussions that you've heard. And the way I'm going to do that is what you've been hearing, of course, is the nature of the problem, what is at stake. And the two things that I'm going to focus on are, I want you to understand the processes, because its commitment and political will has to be proportional to the processes of a landscape that you're trying to change. And I want you to think about that, because the trade-offs that you're dealing with and the complications of those trade-offs are intricately linked to the processes. And then you have to think of solutions, and whenever we think of solutions, it's the engineering. And so we talk about this coastal systems sustainability, and I'll use the MIT model of sustainability, where they refer to the 3 E's, which is the trade-offs have to be a compromise among economy, the environment, and equity. And all 3 of these have to fit into that formula. So let's talk about the processes. Well, fundamentally, this is a river-dominated delta. And from that point on, everything else falls into place. There are 3 S's of this delta. It's all about sand, sediment, and salt. And again, that is the crux, as I'm going to show you in a second, the nature of the trade-offs. Because different stakeholders have a different perspective of how you deal with sand, sediment, and salt. And so I think I clicked this, did I? Is it moving? There we go. So let me go through this delta. And this image, I want to point out a few parts of this image that are very critical relative to what we're trying to achieve. First of all, notice the plume. This is the light color a part of the image, this brown color. Here is the Mississippi River up to the old river control structure. And of course, about 70% of the combined flow of the Red River and Mississippi go past Baton Rouge and New Orleans out past this Bird's Foot Delta into the Gulf of Mexico. About 30% of that flow also goes down the Atchafalaya. And this is the two major entries of the drainage of this 41% of the lower 48 states that we referred to that empties out to the Gulf of Mexico. And the point that I really want to make, 2 points, that we have these two regions that have very different methodologies, or if you will, or processes by which that sediment is delivered. One of which is somewhat natural, although natural is a stretch in a highly engineered landscape. But the thing is, you'll notice the Atchafalaya, how near it is to the shoreline. Look at that sediment plume. The proximity of that sediment to the point of entry is critical to the retaining of that sediment in that shore. Look what we have here in this side, where 70% of the flow, which is artificially being maintained and injected out into the Gulf of Mexico. That sediment is lost. That resource flows by us every day, and that's sort of what drives us nuts. It's, this is not an issue of not having a resource. We have a resource. It's an issue of managing that resource. It flows by us every day, and it's injected out here. Notice the coloration here in these hydrologic basins. There are about 7 basins across the coast, and notice the absence of that sediment plume. So, we've done a very good job of maintaining that sediment out here within the river and injecting it out into the Gulf of Mexico. And you'll also notice that, again, this is a unique feature of our coastline. We are dependent on the river, and we are dependent on the resources it provides. This is an 1874 map of the various crevasses that actually occurred during a flood, and these were areas by which the river overflowed its banks, delivering sediment periodically during very short pulses, not every day and not every year. And so this is the process that was critical, and this process resulting in building land. And again, the normal cycle is over time, land was built, and associated with that landscape are very specific ecological features. That's a very important point. The geomorphology of this system drives the ecology. If you want to restore the ecology, you have to fundamentally restore the geomorphology. And that is so codependent in our area, and it's been very well linked through the sciences and engineering over time. But to build that land, you have to change salinity. This is a trade-off game. If you want land, you have to have a trade-off of salinity. It's the way the system works. And so that is a very important point I want to get back to in a second. Wetlands have a tremendous capability to adapt. A point that I make all the time is that this delta has been developing for 6,000 years. Before human settlement and engineering this landscape, these wetlands were able to adapt to hurricanes. They adapted to sea level rise, and they adapted to subsidence. Those are processes by which these systems, for thousands of years, built a large, sustainable landscape. It is the engineering of the river that has disconnected that capacity to adapt. And just to go through a process as an image so you'll understand that we do have subsidence, land is sinking, sea level is rising, so our wetlands adapt at a rate greater than any other wetland resource in the United States. We can build, in some areas, an elevation of 8 millimeters a year. And so that capacity, though, of being able to do that and to adapt is proportional to the resources by which the river provides. So let me go through a second point of my talk and wrap up here. What are the engineering solutions? And I think I'm going to focus on 3 here that I think are really key, because within these solutions are challenges. And just like Sydney stated, I view this as challenges not just for Louisiana, but these are going to be the challenges that every coastal landscape will face in the future. One is a challenge of actually understanding the context by which we're developing restoration. All restoration projects are responding to a degradation of the system. What I've shown here is a simple little diagram that ecosystem structure and function are processes that altered, they're degraded. We define this in Louisiana by the metric of land loss. Okay, so it's a conversion of land to water as a metric of degradation. The point I want to make here is that we are proposing engineering solutions to move a system along an increment of change. We do a great job at diagnostics. Our disciplines do a really good job of telling you what you did wrong. What we're doing now is prescription, and that's a real challenge for moving natural systems incrementally in a certain direction based on engineering solutions. And that's a challenge to us. What we do in Louisiana, every coastal community will be dealing with in the future. And it takes big scale changes. We are talking about moving a system along that blue line that is the 7th largest delta in the world. So the scale at which we are defining engineering solutions are tremendous, and scaling up our discipline and our engineering capability to respond to that is very important. I'll give you a metric. At the mouth of the Chaffalaya right here is a land gain. We do have areas where we are building a delta. And from 1972 to about 1976, this area that was built from the Chaffalaya River was about 22 square kilometers. That is 1/2 of what we lose in 1 year. So what we're trying to do is actually build a landscape and essentially 2 Chaffalaya equivalents per year. Now, it would be much easier when you get farther inland, and the engineering capabilities there will have a much more impact per unit of river. But it's a very important concept. Remember scale. Second point, I have 3 of these. Structure versus non-structured landscape features. It is not just about the levees. We have to use the wetlands as part of our landscape protection. This image, I think, shows it best of all. These are the coastal forests that used to protect Louisiana and particularly New Orleans. 300 years ago, when the French founded New Orleans, it's 100 river miles from the mouth of the river up to where New Orleans is located. And all along that 100 river miles were coastal forests. They're gone. So that protection system and the way that people evaluated risk when they settled these communities is so different today than it was when they originally used the landscape to interpret where they should put people to live. And that is at the hands of what we've done to this region. We do have a plan. It has these objectives that Sydney went over. But again, we have to find a way that these objectives, 1 through 4 in the plan, through restoration efforts, that can also be accomplished through protection measures of building levees. We do find ways that we minimize conflict between these and find ways of synergies. And again, that is using landscape as part of our reduction in storm surge and reducing our risk through our restoration program. But the point I want to make here again is scale. When you use a wetland to reduce the risk of a storm, it takes a huge extensive area of land. So if we are going to build in that landscape as part of our reducing the risk to storm surge, it has to be an extensive landscape that we're rebuilding. My final point is that the real challenge we have is also related to the river, and it's not just a Louisiana thing. Remember, I said it was sand, sediment, salt brought in by the river. Well, there's a fourth element in that river, and it's nitrate. It comes from the agricultural lands of the center part of the Mississippi River Basin. And the problem there is that nitrate, as you see here in this hypoxia image, is one of the major sources of fueling our hypoxic regions off the Gulf Coast, off our coastal landscape. So while we're trying to build land, as you see here, based upon the river, and reducing salinity by putting fresh water and sediment in, we also have the potential of increasing eutrophication. And we cannot solve that problem in Louisiana. That has to be a problem that echoes up across the basin, and reducing nitrate and land management related to that problem. To give it to you just point blank, the nitrate in that water could literally shut down our river management system to restore our land. That's how serious that is related to our management capabilities. So let me leave you with these last 3 slides. This one, if you read through this, you would think I took from the report. And in blue there, it calls for a conservation policy that should be restoration of those natural conditions. This was actually published in 1928 by Percy Vyaska in the Journal of Ecology in the Ecological Society of America. So we had a vision a long time ago related to the importance and what to do. Let me leave you with this quote. This is civil engineers Paul Hebert and Woodridge, and they talk about nearsighted economic interest to build levees. And if you read the last section there, it says, by urging the state to adopt new policies aimed at keeping open the last few remaining outlets and building artificial ones to replace those already lost, the state engineers tried to temper the drive of many planters to remake the river. This was published in 1847, and they were actually proposing a multiple outlet diversion system to maintain the river and its importance to sustaining the landscape. So what's missing? It's political will, it's fine-tuning the engineering, and we can have a discussion about this perspective when we open it up. And now my last one is one from the Washington Post. You know, is the complications is not a science, it's not engineering, but how we have to, you know, I used to send the recipes over to the kitchen when I was publishing my papers. Now I'm in the kitchen as a cook. and so that we have to get inside the kitchen as scientists, as engineers. We have to be part of the solution. We have to work with all the entities, and it really is the complications of that, which is really a very different perspective as a scientist, and linking those together. More information on what we're doing scientifically you can find at this website, and it really helps to define our objectives and our programs in our coastal restoration from the science and engineering point of view. Thank you very much.
Just one point of clarification on the next to last quote. You said 1947, but it said 1847.
I meant 1847.
1847.
That is correct.
That may
That's
not
a
have been
correct year.
visible, and I want to
I'm sorry.
make sure people understood that. Donald Bosch is professor of marine science and president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He also served as interim vice chancellor for academic affairs of the university system of the state of Maryland. He is a native of New Orleans. He received his BS from Tulane and his PhD from College of William & Mary. He was the first executive director of Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, and he was professor of marine sciences at LSU. He came to Maryland in 1990. He's a biological oceanographer who has conducted research on coastal and continental shelf environments along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico, eastern Australia, and the East China Sea. And he presently is conducting research that focuses on the use of science in eco-management, ecosystems.
Thanks very much, Blair. And I think I'm going to stay seated as well. I'm a little taller than Sydney, but it's more comfortable here. I want to thank you and King Milling for inviting me. King gave the perspective of a prominent, concerned, engaged, and I'd have to say particularly eloquent Louisianan. Sydney described the evolution of coastal restoration planning and how the state has struggled to deal with the needs of both hurricane protection and coastal restoration following the devastating hurricanes of 2005, leading to this plan that we're here to talk about today, Louisiana's Comprehensive Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast. And then Robert, my friend Robert here, gave you an overview of how the science and engineering has been applied. I'm especially proud of the contributions Robert has made in the Louisiana effort. He's widely regarded as the scientific leader in the state by his people in government and business community, but also his academic colleagues. And I helped to draw him there 20 years ago when I was then working in Louisiana. Now, I didn't know at the time that I was recruiting him from the University of Maryland at the time, and I had no idea that I would return to that same institution, and having lost this great young scientist. Nonetheless, I think it's a fair trade. I'm here to give you the outsider's view. Full disclosure, as Blair mentioned, I am a native of New Orleans. In fact, the Ninth Ward, actually. And I've worked there for a part of my career. But I've been here in Maryland for over 17 years now, a pretty healthy part of one's career. So I think it gives me some level of detachment. However, during that period, I've repeatedly served. You can never leave New Orleans or Louisiana if you're born and raised there and understand the culture and the environment. I've repeatedly served as an external advisor and sometimes critic to the planning, hopefully bringing some larger knowledge base and a commitment to rigorous science motivated by my sort of congenital concern about what's going on there, and without the vested interest, hopefully to do the right thing. I think, in reflecting on my background, Robert showed you those relic cypress trees standing there, and King pointed out the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. When I was a boy, I remember when Mr. Go was built. I witnessed firsthand the impacts of the changed environment in Hurricane Betsy, living where I did, experienced flooding, helped people evacuate and the like, and watched those cypress swamps that I used to crawfish in with my father disappear in a small part of my lifetime. And so I think it can't be emphasized too much that this is, although they're mighty natural forces, that the problems that underlie this are ones that we caused, and we can reverse them. As King pointed out, there are no blames on things of the past, the Corps, oil and gas, or whatever the case may be. I think from this point going forward, though, knowing what we now know, I think we have to have a low tolerance for ineptness and high standards of accountability moving forward. So forgiveness of the past doesn't mean we need to forgive and be tolerant of mistakes again in the future. In 1993, following the establishment of John Bro's Coastal Wetlands Protection Planning Restoration Act, QWPRA, I led an external panel that urged a comprehensive planning rather than small projects, Band-Aid approach that QWPRA allowed the state to begin to do at that time. And I participated in also a technical review committee to advise the Corps in the development of the LCA plan. This is the Louisiana Coastal Area Ecosystem Restoration Plan, which is the plan that was now authorized in WRDA, the program authorized in the last WRDA. And it's authorized in the concept, but I think most folks who had worked on the plan look at what happened on the way to authorization, and I think we have now LCA light, if you will, with only some modest first efforts, but hopefully we can build and learn on them. By the way, I should say that plan was actually subject to peer review, not only our own National Review Committee, but also by the National Academy's National Research Council. And I want to point out that Don Wright, in the audience here today, was actually a member of that panel that reviewed the LCA plan. In that plan, that review and many other scientific consensus statements of committees that I've been on and those that haven't, have really emphasized if this is going to be achievable at all, we have to think big and bold. And Robert's concerns, description of the need to get the sediment back in the system on massive scales and the urgency of doing that. Now, we have authorized only small baby steps, if you will, but we quickly need to learn from that and move quickly to these large diversions and deal with the multiple complications and conflicts associated with them. And after Hurricane Katrina, everyone, of course, the Corps was completely preoccupied with, first of all, many of the people who worked in the Corps lost their own homes and were displaced, and trying to deal with the immediate emergency. But since we were a standing group, we said, let's be helpful. And in an uninvited way, in an unsolicited way, we banded together, invited a number of local experts as well as other national experts to come together and provide an unsolicited report we call the New Framework for Coastal Louisiana. That report basically had two straightforward and simple messages, and I think you can probably get it from the presentations thus far. That is, the pursuit of flood protection and navigation interest has diminished the coastal ecosystem, which plays in a critical part protecting the people and from storms, and henceforth the planning and implementation of flood protection, navigation, and ecosystem restoration, the three of the Corps' major functions, Corps of Engineers' major functions, must be integrated. We cannot have them separately pursued. Furthermore, I would add to that virtually everything else that we do. King mentioned oil and gas infrastructure, and that has to be integrated as well. Other types of transportation system, roads, things of that sort have to be integrated as well. And secondly, a fundamental objective that overrides everything else, that has to be the standard by which any plan has to be judged, is the maintenance of a sustainable coastal landscape. And I think you've heard Robert talk about it, and you've heard Sydney describe the evolution of the master plan. In fact, sustainable coastal landscape is in the title of that report as a key objective. Since that time, acting under the direction of the state legislature and Congress, respectively, the state, through the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, that produced the plan, and the Corps of Engineers, through the process that Sydney described, that should be concluding, or at least coming to a milestone this month with a report, have been working on how to do this integration, at least with respect to flood protection, hurricane protection, and wetland coastal restoration. Not yet, I don't think either of them fully address the transportation challenge, but that's, as Cindy pointed out, that's another challenge ahead. They've taken very, from my vantage point on the now another third incarnation of my involvement, chair of the Science Board that advises the LCA plan. But we've been looking at the integrated plans that both the state and the federal government have developed. And from my vantage point, they're markedly different, and maybe that's good, but the state's sort of taken the big picture, the conceptual. Let's look at what we have to achieve more broadly, and we know that we can't design it all right now. We'll work out the details, but this is our vision. This is the direction we're going. The Corps, on the other hand, has taken a more detailed approach, and I'm not so sure it's going to lead to better results. It's going to, I think, give us a number of options that we have to look at and choose from, but there's still a long way to go, as Sydney pointed out, to when we see this vision or see this plan. How do we bring all these ideas together in a way that both the state and the federal government can move forward on? One of the other things, just to remind you that in addition to the kind of reviews that we've talked about, there is yet another National Academies NRC review taking place now of the core plan. It's been a little bit delayed because of the delay of the drafts of that plan, but over the coming months, that independent peer review body will also weigh in and provide its own evaluations and advice going forward. I want to give you some general comments on the challenges of restoring and managing large ecosystems like this. I spend most of my time, I do the Louisiana part of the issues because it's a passion and it's a congenital interest of mine. But I spend most of my time and get paid for working on the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay restoration. In fact, I'm leaving here to join the 3 governors of the region and the administrator of EPA who are meeting today in Annapolis, and with another one-day summit meeting in Annapolis on the Chesapeake restoration. I also am on a National Research Council panel overseeing the Everglades restoration. I'm also on a panel advising the European Union and the 9 nations around the Baltic on the Baltic restoration. And these are always these are complicated challenges. They're not scientifically straightforward in direct. They're all surprises, but also politically, socially challenging issues. So we shouldn't expect that this would be any easier. Louisiana has an advantage, though, in that it's one state really working on this thing, so it can overcome some of the interjurisdictional issues. And I think there's a great recognition that this is vital. This is not a second priority, a third priority. It has got to be at the top, and I think the state is approaching it that way. I think they've taken and tried to develop this sort of science on the fly, real-time science, that you don't do science before you take action, you have to take action. And so this new notion of adaptive management, learning by doing with rigorous science en route, is something that all of these regions are talking about, and I think this region has a chance to really put it into practice. Even more, I might say, as an observer and critic than the Everglades has been able to do at this point. I want to mention 2 other things. One is just to underscore one of the last points that Robert made about the problems of the Mississippi Basin and how that affects the Gulf of Mexico. This hypoxia thing is also a major challenge. Unfortunately, we're at a point where the parties that 7 years ago agreed to take action are now redoing their action plan, and unfortunately the action plan seems to be a bit stepping backwards rather than forwards. I don't think this is acceptable, for a variety of reasons. First of all, on its own merits, we have a national scale challenge ahead to try to address, and we've made commitments to do it. We're not making much progress on it. Secondly, as Robert pointed out, you're giving the state of Louisiana, the folks in Louisiana, a Sophie's choice. Basically, if you want to use that river water to restore the coastal areas, guess what? It's hot, and it's going to worsen your water quality problems, worse than hypoxia. You choose. You can have your coastal restoration, or you're going to have more hypoxia. That's not a reasonable position to be in. And I think for no other reason than to give the flexibility that we need for coastal restoration, reducing the nutrient loads of the Mississippi is an essential part of that strategy. And the last point I want to make, King mentioned the elephant in the closet, I think his term he used. Well, the woolly mammoth in the ice block in the closet is climate change. It's a big deal. I think most of the people in this room know it. It's real, it's on us, and it's going to be an enormous challenge for everywhere, but no place greater than coastal Louisiana. Because of the high rates of relative sea level rise due to the sinking of the land, they already have impressive rates of relative sea level rise. However, Robert pointed out that unlike many other areas, this region has the material, the capacity to counteract that with respect to restoring wetland systems using the constructive power of the river. That power is not limitless. That power is not limitless. And if we look at the geological history of the Mississippi Delta, and by the way, one of the great things that the coastal Louisiana restoration has going for it is a very rich and detailed science of the geology of that system that helps us understand how the place was built, and therefore what we need to do to continue to build it and maintain it. If we look at that, you know that the delta did not build in very high rates of sea level rise after glaciation. In fact, the coast was retreating. So unless we make a commitment, unless there is a commitment and an action to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gases by the middle of this century, and that means we have to start now, it's not going to be achievable. We might be able to sustain the coast through this century, but it's not going to be sustainable under the rates of sea level rise that are galloping of the scale of half a meter or more a year in the 21st century. If we reach that, what the IPCC calls that singularity of the melting of the polar ice caps, we are committing ourselves on a global basis to meters of sea level rise. And we have to take action now in the first part of the 20th century to avoid that possibility. Now, it would seem to me, with that background, maybe we need to communicate it, that the leaders, the political leaders of Louisiana, ought to be the ones who get that and are out front. Now, obviously, there are conflicts because there's an energy industry there. It's obviously important to the economy. But we're going to need energy. We're just going to need energy in more sophisticated ways. And in fact, if we don't resolve it, we're back to the same conflicts we've had before that Robert pointed out in 1847, that the oil and gas industry had to confront. And we have to make those hard choices. And I don't think they're either-or choices. They're choices that are sustainable and make sense in terms of how we use the fossil fuel energy, the resources of that region, in a changing world in which we manage climate. But the political leadership, I think, your Louisiana, and all due respect to them, your Louisiana senators and members of Congress ought to be on the front lines on this issue. Otherwise, they don't understand or they don't support the notion of long-term sustainability of their own state. A state which, by the way, has about my calculation, something like 22% of its land area below 1.5 meters of elevation. So that's the scope in which we're looking at, 22% of the existing land area. So thanks very much, and I'd be happy to participate in the discussion.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for being very punctual. We're on time. We have a little over an hour, and a lot has been put before you, so I think we'll just open it up for questions, comments, observations, challenges right here, and we'll get you a microphone right now. Okay.
Morning. Is it working? It is. My name is Jane Siegel. I'm with the Department of Commerce. I wanted to address the management issue, and by that I mean political, social, economic management, sort of countrywide. And I think the sort of our federal system, which gives you sub-federal state authority and federal authority, it's been addressed. You've alluded to it several times. I wonder what you think of a scheme that would create a similar process to what we have in building highways, where the system is the state and metropolitan areas must come up with a plan presented to the federal government if a road needs to be built. This is much more simple. The elements of this much more simple than what you all were talking about. But you know what I'm talking about. ICE-T, T200, 2000. Whether that design would create a sense countrywide of the kinds of problems generally sustainability and ecosystem management would require. I know in the Chesapeake Bay, it's the nutrient issue. That's the critical issue. That's quite different from coastal restoration, at least now in 2007. So is that a model where you would have solutions prepared at the local level, at the ecosystem level, not at sort of the political level with a dictation of a political priority of an agency or something like that?
I'll start, but I'm sure y'all all can join in on this. I think yes. I think would that be the perfect model? No, but that's why I'm encouraging all of us who are involved in ecosystem restoration throughout the country to sit down and look at what exists right now. Maybe take from some of that. It really has to be based on a program approach. We've got to get away from this parochial, individual project kind of mindset. I mean, we're trying to do that right here in Louisiana, but on the national level, it gets exponentially harder. Yes, I think that something like, and we've talked about it before, the transportation model could be something we could pull from. I don't think it would be a perfect thing. The MRT is another thing that we can look at as well, and are looking at, and I think all of those things may somehow be pulled from.
Let me jump into this a little bit. We discussed it last night over dinner. If you look at all of these large-scale ecosystem problems, whether it's the Everglades, Cal-Fed, Upper Miss, or Louisiana, the fact of the matter is that these things are significantly larger than the local economies can handle. And the consequences of allowing the destruction to occur have significance far beyond those local areas. One of the frustrations we have, quite frankly, is the fact that in the modern world, this may be an overreach, but we have very little domestic programs. We have no capacity on a national basis to prioritize actions. And as a result of it, we have things like the WRDA bill, where pieces are given out to every state in the union, and our senators and members of the House go home and declare victory, and very little is accomplished. We face this, and every other ecosystem area in the country faces it as well. I had an opportunity to be in Sacramento, 2 months ago, where they're discussing a major problem concerning their levee systems out there. And the ramifications of the destruction of that levee system in Sacramento in terms of this country are just mind-boggling. Could destroy literally the whole area of California that feeds much of this country. And the country knows nothing about it. Sacramento can't pay for it. The Corps of Engineers has been involved in the construction of levee systems out there for years, and only now are looking at it in terms of what may or may not be done. The national priority established by Eisenhower with the highway system obviously was of a national scope. The Mississippi River construction of levees after the 27 flood was of a national scope. The TVA, whether you like it or not, was of a national scope. But it all recognized that there were significant things that were far beyond the economic capacity of individual regions, and that there were significant things that had to be done. I don't know how we get that national demand, that national sense of priority properly at the table. But Louisiana's issue, although I would suggest that if you compare all of the impacts, oil and gas, fishing, and the rest of it, it becomes fairly paramount. But I'm not in the business of comparing. I'm in the business only of pointing it out. And this country's got to make some hard decisions, and so far has been unwilling to do so.
I just want to add one little thing to that. That whole issue of national priority setting, I think, is huge. And I know that in the past, and very much at the present, it's been put on the states to do that. Prioritize your projects that you're going to ask for in WRDA, which we do. We do prioritize them. But there is that bigger, and it's hard. Politically, it's very hard for the federal, at the top level, to prioritize. Talk to me about how hard that is to prioritize, even in your own state. It's very difficult, but it has to be done. And the Corps is very willing to help in that process and have made that very clear. And I think our other federal agencies have to help in that process, help the Congress see their way through to making those very tough political decisions and prioritize these efforts.
The priorities are at a number of levels. First of all, the nation has to make a judgment about where the long-term natural capital, our ecosystems, and the importance to humans fits in all the other priorities. In that sense, one of the things which I observed was particularly irritating to the folks in Louisiana is the amount of money and effort, diversion of personnel who are working on Louisiana coastal area to restoring wetlands in Iraq, for example. But getting back to the issue about how do we make priorities within our national commitments to restore and manage ecosystems, one of our friends and colleagues, John Barry, the noted author, who is now a member of one of the levee boards in Louisiana, commented that maybe we need something like a BRAC, a base realignment and closure, so that there's a blue ribbon committee that determines what the priorities are, proposes them, and Congress votes it up or down without trying to, earmark every little detail. I don't know, but we need some way to break out of this.
I have Fred Starr, then we'll go to the woman there and the gentleman up here. Fred?
I wonder if you can tell us whether any of the prospective candidates in either party have registered any particular consciousness of this issue or approach to it in the dimensions that King Milling has set forth.
Well, I don't want to get into that. I can tell you that we have been with a series of the candidates, and there have been, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, a few of them, not all of them, who have not gone into the depth of this, but have registered the seriousness of this issue and the recognition, excuse me, that we must try to do something about it. Now, getting into details, obviously, that's a whole nother ball of wax. But the answer is yes. All of them know. And I think in some measure that is the fact that the issue of coastal Louisiana is well known to those who have dealt with it prior to Katrina. Katrina, quite frankly, has made New Orleans probably more New Orleans-centric than it should be. This is an area that, New Orleans is a composite of so many, and what happened to it is a composite of so many different issues. But I think there are some that are fixated, at least understand these issues. Whether or not any of them are prepared to take the hard political decisions to begin the process of prioritization and to, in my mind, to be totally cynical, take the scientific and engineering decisions out of OMB, which is where it is today, and put it where it should be, is a whole nother ball of wax for the future to determine.
Okay, we'll go back. Woman there, this gentleman here. Okay, then we'll come over here.
Hi, my name is Andra Popa, and I'm a legal extern with the United Nations Environment Program. And my question is, to what extent are international models being considered in some of the plans to restore the coastal wetlands? Because I know that the UK is pretty progressive on this issue, and I was just curious.
Yeah, let me make one comment about that, and from a very personal note, having worked quite a bit internationally on coastal problems, my calibration basically to this issue was experience I had working in actually the fifth largest river in South America, which is the Magdalena River, which I helped the restoration of the Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta. And it was a fascinating experience because it's a delta where the mangrove loss was 50% of the entire area. We helped design with the engineers the proper system to replace the river back into that delta. And we ran models related to what we projected would be the response. And the nature fooled us. The nature, the resiliency of that system was much greater than we anticipated in our modeling efforts. And it was just spectacular for me for the short time we were able to stay down working after the system was rebuilt as to what the capacity of these systems to actually come back once they're provided the resources. We've worked in, the other areas that I've worked in certainly all acknowledge the constraints on water resources in deltas. It is a again, this calibration that I keep referring to, the incremental loss of resources with the incremental loss of rivers upstream for other purposes, and that conflict. You can test this out. Bangladesh is having a problem, with salt water intrusion in the delta, and it just plays out over the world. And then the European community certainly sees the climate change and sea level rise. And what strikes me there as a model personally that I have been lecturing on quite a bit is the Foresight program, where the United Kingdom has actually developed a system of prioritizing some of the big national agendas. And one of the first programs they took on was flooding and coastal issues related to climate change. And of course, when you live on an island, you have a tendency to do that. But again, what there I think is a sense of urgency and national priority, and the way they brought in the scientists to actually help forecast and deal with some of the issues. And I'm sure Don can tell you many more. But I think that these models from verification of the nature of the problem. In my experience, seeing a restoration project actually prove itself as to what the potential it can achieve. And then thirdly, the ability to actually establish national priorities if you put your mind to it.
Any other?
I was thinking you might want to mention the Dutch, which you've been...
I do. A couple of things real quick. The Dutch, we are working with the Dutch now and have been. And it's, the Dutch decided to make it a national commitment. That's where the political will came for. We aren't quite there yet in this country, and we're working with them very, very closely. We brought in America's Wetland Foundation was instrumental in bringing in a team of scientists from all across the globe who came to a 3-day summit a couple of years ago, I think it was, and looked at what was necessary conceptually, and it's that whole what do we do with the mouth of the Mississippi River issue. And on sort of bringing it up to the 100,000-foot level, I would like to say that I know that we need to look at this. Sometimes when, a prophet in your own land, when you're sitting here in America, we fail to see that the Mississippi River Delta is absolutely as sacred and important as the Ganges and the Mekong and the Orinoco and all of these great deltas of our earth. And it is our responsibility, those of us here right now, to take care of the situation, to do something about this, and to look at them as a whole. And I'm hoping very much that the UN will work with us on the environmental level and help us bring those great deltas together so that we can look at the commonalities and the common solutions.
Okay, we'll go back to the floor. This gentleman, then I have the woman over here, and then we'll go back on this side.
Sure. Hi, my name's Dave Evans. I'm director of the Wetlands Division here at EPA, and just moved to that job a couple of months before the hurricane, so in the last couple of years I've paid a lot of attention to this. I'd just like to first say thank you probably for everyone here. A wonderful hour overview and really comprehensive treatment of this subject. Couple of observations I want to make and see what discussion it might lead to. I think couldn't be more clear from all of your remarks how important it is to combine structural solutions with ecological restoration. And I think historically there's been concern that there hasn't been enough recognition of the important role, not just for the sustainable ecology, fisheries and the like, but for sustainability of the human habitats of the ecology of the region. And so a question, and I'll ask another one because that one might be more palatable to answer. Do you feel that the Corps of Engineers leading the LACPR effort has that same important recognition of the critical role of the ecological component? Second observation is very clear that public and private contributions and partnerships will be essential, that there's no avoiding the need for federal appropriations, but I think the price tag is such that none of us can feel confident that federal appropriations will be but a small down payment of it. So having the longer-term oil and gas revenue stream, the very creative approach I think the state is taking to issue bonds and leverage those funds in the near term begins to close the gap, and yet the price tag still is huge. And a question I have here is whether there are additional opportunities and perhaps even responsibilities for the private sector, oil and gas industry, perhaps fisheries and recreation, transportation, commercial transportation, to provide additional and direct contributions in partnership with government action.
I'll take the first part of it, and I'll leave the other funding aspects to you folks. The interesting thing is that before Katrina, when we were working on, and the Corps was working on in the state working on the LCA plan, the Louisiana Coastal Area Ecosystem Restoration Plan, the process was prohibited from working into the assessment of the benefits of alternatives, flood mitigation, flood risk protection. And the reason is that this was authorized as a national ecosystem restoration. There are two accounts, or at least two accounts in the Corps, and then there's another one with national economic development. So if you're in the national economic development, you have to do cost-benefit analysis and all these other kinds of things. And so we said, no, we can't get into that. We have to, that may be a side benefit, but it shouldn't be involved in the consideration and quantified. Katrina changed all that. And so Congress has directed, as did the Louisiana legislature, both the state and the federal Corps, to put the two together. It's a painful merger, as Sydney pointed out, and there's still some problems with it. For example, there's in Louisiana and elsewhere, there's a great degree of concern about coast-wide flood protection levees that encompass and therefore cut off tidal wetlands from the areas, other areas, and these are in the plans for study. So we'll have to sort through that. The other thing is that the Corps in the LACPR, there's so many acronyms. This is the integrated plan. Is working on trying to using actually very good tools, storm surge models and the like, to understand the role of wetlands in reducing storm surge. Initially, their attitude when they first saw the results was that, well, you know, there's not much of an effect. I mean, a large storm surge 20 feet high, and the marsh plants are only a few foot or so above the ground. The frictional losses are not significant. But we asked them to ask the other question a different way. What if that landscape, you know, that near sea level extensive landscape, were not there? And if you run the model that way and you take away the wetlands, and instead of a wetland at sea level, you've got a lake at 10 feet of water, then the storm surge effects are enormous. And so that's been brought into this new integration. And we'll just have to wait and see in terms of the product about how successful that integration has taken place.
Let me just add a few comments about that, not from a scientific level, I can assure you, I'm not there. I think there's been some significant change in the mindset of the Corps of Engineers, but I do believe that you're still looking at 250 years of history and a military position. There are individuals at the lower level, I say the lower level involved, that clearly understand that the rationale of combining restoration with protection is an essential feature. There are those who recognize that the Corps can build all the lovely levees in the world, but if we don't have a landscape in front of it that can help preserve it, we are destined to rebuild levees over and over and over again, which is what's happened, quite frankly, in Holland today. But the traditional levels of the Corps, it's hard to get them to focus on it, I think. And I think that's been the case almost from day one. It's just the legal mindset of the Corps is such that you can't do anything to inferentially criticize what has happened in the past, and that's not what we've done. So there are an awful lot of issues at the table, but I do believe they're gradually getting there. One of the real issues we have is that we look at this on a programmatic basis. Which means we've got to begin to put it on a large scale, as Sydney said, a very large scale process, which makes us continually look at both of these issues. The Corps has a hard time going there, but they're significantly better.
And I'll just add a couple of comments to that. You haven't lived until you've had the joy of dealing with Corps attorneys. and so I'm glad you brought that Corps legal aspect up. That's good.
As a lawyer, I felt responsible, huh?
And I think though when you really, if I want to be fair about it and I really want to be objective about it, yes, I think the Corps is coming to grips with the environmental side of this being absolutely important and absolutely critical. I think that it always takes pushing to make sure that they're not just looking at wetland restoration in terms of how it affects or interacts with protection. I think that it's always a struggle to get the Corps to understand that the environmental side of things need to be dealt with in their own right. And there is some very valuable language that was put in the Word bill that asked Congress to look at the state's plan when it receives, as well, when it receives the Corps plan, and that was very, very critical to the state. Because we know we're going to be dealing with it in a slightly different way in a lot of instances, and but we have to work together. I mean, the Corps is a very key federal partner, and how we get there, we have to work together. But I'd like to see the state continue to lead that effort.
I'm going to go back to the floor, but he asked a second question about public-private.
You go ahead.
Oh yes. Look. This is a $55 billion plan, okay? It's going to take about 30 to 40 years to complete it. Based on revenue sharing right now that is projected to come in, that's not going to be near enough unless we expand that notion of revenue sharing and expand it to other areas in the Gulf that we can pull from, which, of course, we'll continue to fight for. Which brings us to the reality of we're not going to save it all. We're not. It's impossible. Not trying to. Not trying to restore it to some historic configuration of what it was in the past. It can't happen. It can't be done. There are not enough dollars or years left in this coast, I think, to do that. That's why the decisions we make and how we go forward right now in prioritization are going to be so critically important, because the object is to sustain the values of this coast for the national benefit. Is that going to take a huge amount of private, public partnerships? You bet it is. You bet it is. And we can't get there without that. And we're looking at that all the time, believe me.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the list. We have this woman here, then this gentleman, and the next gentleman, and we'll keep the list open.
Hi, my name's Meredith Taylor. I work at the Climate Institute, And I apologize because I don't have the plan in front of me, and I don't know if this is in there, but have you thought at all about, or do you have any ideas about how all of this highly technical science and even the solutions that come out of it can be translated down to a level that the general public can understand? Because I think it's very important to have understanding at that level. It creates buy-in. I think it can create that political will that's so necessary, and even affect individual behavior and lifestyle choices that are also going to be essential. So I don't know if that's been discussed at all, but if you have any ideas about how to do that and then how to reach out with that information, that'd be great.
And before Robert gets in, I just want to very, very briefly say this plan, and if please pick up a copy out there, is very readable. Believe me, if I can understand this plan, I am not a scientist or an engineer. It is written so that everybody can understand this plan. It is an easy-to-understand plan. And there has been a tremendous amount of public input into this plan, tremendous amount, and will continue to be. It's very critical that the public, especially in Louisiana, understands it at a gut level because they're going to help make these tough choices. And they know that. And the state itself and our parishes, which are like most of your counties, our parishes have been on the forefront of understanding that they have to put those parochial issues aside, and they've joined together like I don't think in the history of this state they ever have. And they know that if they don't join together on it, we're all going to lose, and they'll lose the ultimate. They'll have the ultimate cost.
Let me also add that there are significant linkages between what happens in South Louisiana and, for example, all up and down the Mississippi River and the Missouri and the Ohio. If the Mississippi River is closed, the impacts upon the delivery of corn is significant in ways that are just hard to even describe. Briefly happened after Katrina, but this could happen on an ongoing basis. If the intercoastal waterway system is effectively impacted in ways that it no longer is functioning, that allows for the cheap delivery of bulk cargo east and west and north and south on the East Coast, and that will have a fantastic and horrible impact upon the country. Of course, the idea of oil and gas in terms of delivery to 50% of the refineries and chemical and petrochemical companies to be put into commodities that everyone in this room uses, whether you like it or not, every day of the year, is a phenomenal impact. And these are the things these are the real impacts upon the country, and we preach them continually. But at the end of the day, and this gets back to the issue of prioritization, all politics is local. And it is hard sometimes to get somebody in Iowa to understand the implications of a closed Mississippi River, or the implications of the inability to get oil products to them, which they desperately need to run their farms. They think of it on a momentary basis, but translating it into an overriding problem becomes a different issue. That's why we've got to begin to think of these issues, I think, as national priorities, because regions, particularly in this day and time, are not prepared to take on the economic impacts of things of the types of which we're talking about.
A comment I'd like to make real quickly is that, right after the hurricane, I actually participated in the framework meeting that Don organized with IWR, I think, and so we sat around. Of course, it was very immediate. A lot of discussion what needs to be done, and when we went back to Louisiana, fundamentally what we observed is that all the discussions related to the urgency by which we respond to the two hurricanes fundamentally fell upon how well people understood the system, how it worked. How does the system work? Because what happened right after that hurricane was everyone's idea about the Delta, and you could see that the trade-offs and the discussion of trade-offs and decision-making were just fundamentally flawed because of this misunderstanding of how the system worked. So we actually worked with the University of Maryland, this IAN program, and we brought down Bill Dennison. And the first thing we did, working with Bill Dennison, we published three what we call conceptual ecological models, three newsletters or pamphlets. And in that pamphlet, we tried to just write down the fundamental concepts about the system and then use that to help explain and work with people through trade-offs. And then I had a huge amount of work went into working with the public, giving presentations, and every one of those was just Delta Restoration 101, and just getting people to understand how the system works. And I'll tell you, that has a huge, I think the educating, if you don't do that, then, you're really working on flawed perceptions, and flawed perceptions, of course, we know what that means related to decision making.
Another important public communications task and audience are the people of Louisiana. I think that there needs to be I think there is very broad, as indicated by the vote on the constitutional amendment. There's very broad concern. It is a priority. It is a point of concern. People of Louisiana want it dealt with. I don't think there's as much a concomitant realization of how it's going to affect them and how they're going to have to adapt in order to accommodate the changes which are going to have to, science says, are going to have to take place to deal with them. I'll give you a story illustrated. A certain former governor, one of the three governors who Sidney worked for, I won't mention his name, was concerned because area that he fished in was he would like to catch redfish and speckled trout, saltwater fish, and it was becoming fresher because of the way the diversions of the Atchafalaya River and the way that was working, and he didn't like that. So he said, "Well, I'm all for coastal restoration, but I want to be able to catch the fish where I always caught them," and that's not going to be possible. If we're going to start moving massive amounts of water around, it's going to change things. Another example, a certain soon to retire senior senator from Mississippi, objected to some of these plans and programs because he wanted to see a certain amount of water directed through Lake Pontchartrain to Mississippi for the oyster growers there. Well, that conflicted with the challenges of trying to maintain the broader coast objective as well as maintaining the quality of Lake Pontchartrain. So that regional community needs to understand the choices before them and the accommodations and adaptations they'll have to make.
Okay, I have this gentleman right here, then that gentleman, and then we'll begin to wrap up.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Bender. I've worked for 40 years in urban and regional development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and now live on Tillman Island in the Chesapeake. So I'm acquainted with many of these issues and have visited New Orleans several times. The entire panel has given us excellent insight to much of the diagnostic and as well as the forecast of the consequences. As conclusions, it would seem as on the one hand we are at a crisis, although I don't think I heard that word at the present this morning.
Then that's been unfortunate.
Okay. And that we are, unfortunately, from my point of view, government by program. We are what we will fund, and we have no bigger vision than that. And taking, from my point of view, the stance that will is relative, certainly throughout the entire 20th century, those who benefited from the billions of dollars spent on Mississippi Delta and the lower Mississippi waterworks and other programs certainly thought that their political leaders or government had will because they got what they want. Will seems to be, if I get what I want, you have will. If I don't get what I want, you don't have will. So the question to the panel is, what will be the signs in this American democracy where we will actually be dealing with this issue of the lower Mississippi or the entire Mississippi Delta or the Chesapeake or all the other ones, not based on crisis, but based on something more than government by program?
Silence.
Well, there's a question.
I have my answer.
You have your answer. Go
Well,
ahead.
I don't know. You know, I always, there's a lecture I give where I talk about the noise to signal ratio of, you know, and being an ecologist and a scientist and trying to educate and talk about system dynamics and that systems are not static. You know, you have to sort of talk about the urgency of something that's happening related to the noise that we know that's occurring. And of course, you know, the noise of what we're seeing, I mean, the signal that we're seeing of how these systems are changing and their consequences are dramatic. And I think that's just going to be more amplified with climate change. So I think that signal would become more apparent. And I think that that what you will see as far as how this plays out is retreat. And I think that whether that's because of insurance or what other calamities or whatever, but you'll just, you know, I think retreat in my mind would be that signal that will actually, you know, sort of will be the metric that will document the fact that, you know, nothing is, you know, that the crisis is taken over.
As a historian as well as a lawyer, you've raised a real kind of conundrum. We, South Louisiana or in Louisiana, always asked, how do we keep our interest in this? And the question is, I think I said it earlier, we really have no choice. When we look at I mean, there are thousands of reasons not to do what we've put on the table. That's true with our issue, that's true with the Chesapeake, that's true with many of them, and I'll just focus on South Louisiana. There are 1,000 reasons not to do it, and each of them have credibility until you focus on the impacts if we don't do it. And the devastation related to that, not only as to the local area, but the region and the impacts upon the nation are such that ultimately you focus on that and all those reasons become irrelevant. I don't know how at this point in time you get a point where this country begins to focus on that implication, not only as it relates to South Louisiana, but to Sacramento, to whatever the world it may be. I think at the same time, it's like a lot of things. It's like Governor Foster, who was concerned about that salt water, but he was the person, quite frankly, in a very brief moment, stood up in front of 600 people and declared war against coastal erosion. Changed the whole discussion. One voice, one message. It's going to take leadership at the top. It's going to take some president walking in and saying, we're doing it wrong. We can't have OMB making significant engineering and scientific decisions anymore. We've got to look at these things in terms of impacts upon the nation as a whole and the psyche of the nation and why we are a union and not a confederacy. We stopped that concept, I think, at the end of the 1700s, and we resolved the issue then. We recreated that issue one more time, and it was destroyed again in the middle of the 19th century, thank the Lord. We're a union. And there are areas of this country that are facing problems that are so large scale, somewhat because of the amalgamation of people, and that these areas no longer have the capacity to taking them on. It will take leadership at the top to understand these priorities, to begin to put them in place and demand that the Corps of Engineers do what the Corps has said that they want to do, which is to go back and look at all of the things that they've got on their plate, 90% of which probably are irrelevant, but 10% of which are critical, and begin to do that. That's the only way I think at the end of the day we can do this. And but for that, we've got to begin to scratch for every penny and fight for all the issues we can and get the OCS revenue and the occasional word of bill and the rest of it, and hope somebody wakes up to the reality of the significance to this country. That's probably more philosophical than you wanted, but that's where it is.
Okay. You, sir.
My name is Don Wright. I'm a coastal oceanographer with some roots in the Louisiana mud, and I'm certainly a Louisiana-ophile, if there is such a thing, and I know all of you are those. It's clear that the problem that you've all described is very large scale. That does not set it apart from many other projects like it in the world. But what is also clear is that the complexity of the problem is unprecedented. I can't imagine any coastal problem anywhere being more complex in terms of the intersection of scientific problems and socioeconomic problems than what you have in Louisiana. And I think, Sydney, you emphasized the need for integration, and it was implicit in everything I heard from all of you that there needs to be integration. You've got to integrate across this problem of how do you protect against inundation, but at the same time, as you pointed out, you can't isolate that problem from the problem of ecosystem restoration. There has to be an integrated approach to that. And then Robert Twilley and Don Bosch pointed out that there's another problem in coastal Louisiana, and that's the influx of nutrients and the consequent hypoxia. And you can't really isolate that problem either, even though that's not a Corps of Engineers problem so much as it's probably an EPA problem. And this sort of begins to raise the question of, well, when you talk about integration, you've clearly got to integrate across scientific processes. You also have to integrate across cultures that are extremely diverse in Louisiana and socioeconomic interests. But now we've got the biggest challenge perhaps of all, and that is integrating across federal stovepipes, across agencies. And if this is going to work and that integration is going to be effective, there needs to be some kind of management system set up that ensures that there is interagency management and that the decisions are made with all parties at the table somehow. And I guess my question is for you, what plans are afoot to make that happen? And if not, then what do we need to do?
Go ahead.
I'm just going to take a first shot at it real quick. Yes, yes, yes. That is absolutely, absolutely right. And just from the state's level, you know, we've got we're building a policy team right now of our own state agencies because right now at this very moment we know that we've got policies that are being seen through by, say, wildlife and fisheries that are in direct conflict with where we're trying to go with coastal restoration. We've got to resolve those, and we've got to resolve them quickly because all these agencies have a mission. They have a mission that they're fulfilling. And then once we get our own house in order, which we hope will be done fairly quickly because we're only dealing with one state, but as you say, a very complex situation, we're coming to the federal government and the federal agencies, and we want them to sit down with us because you can't apply the same policies in Louisiana because of its extremely unique nature that you can to, say, New York or Oregon even. It's because of the unique nature of this ecosystem, cookie-cutter policies don't work. And how we do bring all of those players to the table, again, I think is going to go back to leadership and making it a federal priority, and it's got to come from the top, that we can't do it like this anymore and that we can't have this parochial mindset from, you know, the top all the way down through Congress and then down to the states. Very difficult, but very hugely important. Absolutely.
I want to, first of all, take a little exception that this is the most complex thing you can imagine. I mean, you know, look at the other big challenge we're trying to deal with, global climate change all around the world. Talk about a complex scientific, technical, socioeconomic. I mean, it makes this doable appear doable by comparison. And yet, you know, we have people yesterday from Bali to Bethesda who are sitting down working on plans that we can lick this problem, and these are the things we need to do. So I think it's a matter of resolve and organization and commitment. I want to comment on your last point about, you said it was even most difficult at all to deal with the stovepiping. Now, if indeed that's the most difficult thing we have to do, we're in real trouble, because compared to the other things, it seems to me to be solvable. One of the things I've observed, who have done a lot of work on working on federal science issues, various all around the country and at a national level, as well as working all my career in state universities, is that it happens sometimes in states. It happens because the leaders demand that it happens. You know, that there's an adjudication process so that the state speaks with one voice. And I think this is what they went through with the LACPR. This is what we've been going through with Governor O'Malley in his Baystat program in the Chesapeake Bay, where he has the cabinet officers there for 2 hours every month, and he expects progress, and he won't take no for an answer, and he find ways to force people to resolve these issues. The problem in the federal government, I don't see there's any federal adjudication process. There's no process within the executive branch that really makes a decision on these things about what is the federal position. And so the state is when it goes to the table, particularly with QIPRA, for example, where there were 5 federal agencies, it's like wrestling with an octopus. You need to solve this problem on the federal level of how to bring the federal, and I see it in the Everglades as well. They bring the diverse federal interests. Sure, they have missions, but there's a way to resolve it and determine what the right thing to do. And to do that, it takes leadership.
Yeah, I just want to comment. Someone who I've had the pleasure of interacting with, Jerry Galloway up at the University of Maryland, and Jerry and I think one of the proposals that I really like is using something like the Mississippi River Commission, and was referenced to MRT. But the point I want to make about that is, number one, you know, a lot of the problems that we're going to try to solve through integration, we have to start at the river basin perspective. Chesapeake Bay, that's how they started moving toward their resolution. We can't solve our problems without the entire Mississippi River basin somehow being integrated. And so there has to be through a commission like that brings the groups together to solve problems in basin-wide is really critical, that has you know, the authority through the federal government. The second thing, the biggest frustration I have had working the last 5 years in this program is seeing that we are out there to accomplish something relative to the mission of any agency without the language and authority from the legislative branch or even from the executive branch. There are projects and structures right now. I've even made the comment we could actually have a huge impact on restoring coastal Louisiana without spending a penny if we just reauthorize all the federal water control structures. And in that authorization said that the operation of that structure was to enhance coastal restoration. Because without that authority, even some structures were not allowed to flood wetlands by operating the structures. We actually just had a meeting the other day over the Violet Canal that just came out of Order 2007, and we're hearing from the lawyers that we're not allowed to put sediment in the Lake Bourne area. It is for salinity control. Why? Because that's what the authorization says. So while we're out talking all this restoration, the authorization that's coming from the legislative branch or legislative point of view does not even give us the authority to do what we're trying to achieve as far as the goals and a plan such as this. As long as you have that disconnect, I can't do what I'm trying to do out in the field.
This actually leads me to the question I've been contemplating. This is a wonderful report, and when I read it, I was both inspired and terribly depressed. And I was
Join the group.
And I was terribly depressed because when you begin to appreciate what has to happen, and it really does, as I said in my opening remarks, require that we change the way that we live. So I wanted to ask you, I want to put a slightly different twist on this. If we project out 50 years, you're all very experienced people. Where do you think we'll be 50 years from now, given the realities of behavior and the realities of the problem that we confront? What's your best guess of what southern Louisiana will be like 50 years from now?
Well, I think we aren't here because we're defeatist. I mean, I think all of us have an optimistic view that we'll be making progress in the right direction. I would think that the test is, if it's put it this way, the test is that if we can first of all understand that in the very long term that Louisiana has to understand and deal with climate change. Otherwise, the skeptics about whether it's survivable or right, if we don't come to grips with that. And unless we've actually at the stage where we're putting into place and watching it work, one or two very large river diversions, we will, at that point, 50 years from now, my advice would be quite different than what it is today. I'd be telling people, prepare for retreat.
You go ahead, Sydney.
I just want to make one short statement. What happened, in order to answer that question, what happens, seriously what happens in the next 5 to 10 years is going to tell that tale. And it really will. It'll set the stage.
I have great belief in the capacity of the scientific and engineering community in this country and in this world, and I think it will take a conglomeration of all of those intelligences to come to the table to begin to deal with this issue. I think that until such time, though, as we really begin to implement, there will always be great hesitation to want to deal with it. But once you begin to implement, once you begin to really see the amalgamation of new thoughts we don't even have on the table today, and new concepts for doing this, this is a snowball that has an opportunity maybe to begin to roll downhill. That people are going to begin to understand and see it and get aware of the fact that we can do something that when you read that report, you're right, you get scared. It's so large, it's so massive, it's so complex, you're really not sure you want to get your hands around it. But if you can begin to implement great science and great engineering, which it will take, then I think we will see that this project will begin to gain significant impacts. The other thing to remember is this, and this is with the lady from the UN, what we do in South Louisiana, or what we don't do in South Louisiana, will have significant impacts throughout the world. Every delta in this world is facing the issues one way or the other that we are facing. And if we can solve it, if we can begin to solve it, we're the only country probably in this time that can bring the real, true intellectual forces of science and engineering to the table. If we can begin to do that, these solutions are transferable. And thereby we are doing something far more important than just taking care of our own very important issue, but we're beginning to figure out a way to lead the country, the world, to be able to do things that will have benefits in other parts of the world. That, too, should begin to trigger additional impetus to move forward. There are times I will tell you I wake up in the morning and wonder, what in the hell am I doing? But again, it all goes back to focusing on the reality of what happens if we don't do this. And that is just not acceptable. That's not acceptable to the state, and it damn well should not be acceptable to the country. We cannot allow this area that's so vital to the rest of the country to go by the wayside because there is inability for this country to understand what the union's about and what the responsibilities of the national government are about.
We'll go back to actually the year 2015, when the funding and money is always a major part of the ability to act and to build the kinds of projects that we're trying to achieve. Actually, would be the year I plan to retire. But so there's sort of this perspective of what we're doing now, because we are all optimists to actually see this project fundamentally laid out conceptually now that will move us to the future. But the point I want to make is that, I showed the quote of the state engineer, or the engineer for the state of Louisiana in 1847, that actually talked about how the system works and what needs to be done. And that is not what's at hand here. I think we've understood that even since Percy Viaska published in 1928. his statement. So I think a lot about the history of decisions that we've made. Real quickly, we've had 172 floods and 65 hurricanes to hit Louisiana over the last 150, 200 years. We have dealt with catastrophes. We've dealt with these. So it's what's different this time? What are we going to do differently relative to this concept of sustainability? Is it more new discovery and engineering? Is it new scientific technology? What is it? And I'll tell you what I have come to the conclusion, and I think it says a lot about what we've been saying here today, is really our value system related to wealth. Because when you really define wealth and you really talk to people about what's important and you do trade-offs and you talk about the perspective, I think when you read the way that decisions were made in the 1850s related to how we perceive the wealth of certain elements that we're working with, that I hope that in the next 50 years, if we don't redefine our value system of wealth, then I really don't think we will, even with money, actually do anything better or any more improved than what we did in the past. So that's where I think the real issue is, are we better off 50 years from now?
Okay, I'm going to wrap up the formal session. I encourage private conversation, but I have to ask